Hey, what's up, biology students? Welcome to the virtual lecture on an introduction to metabolism and ATP. In this video, we're going to classify organisms by how they acquire energy. We're going to discuss the two major forms of potential energy that is utilized by cells. And lastly, we'll talk about a very special molecule called ATP. So remember that one of the fundamental characteristics of any living thing is the ability to acquire energy from the surrounding environment and to then convert that energy into a form that is usable for the individual cells that make up that organism. This process of acquiring energy from the environment and converting it into a usable form is a part of the organism's metabolism. So there are two general ways that energy enters a living thing from the environment. The first way is that an organism can absorb radiation, basically visible light from the sun, and somehow harness and convert that energy into food, like carbohydrates, for instance. These organisms that are able to absorb sunlight energy undergo a process called photosynthesis. We will cover that in our next module. Other organisms can acquire energy by consuming, basically by eating. In either case, whether you're consuming food or, like a plant, and building your own food, you have to subsequently break down that food into a more usable form of energy for cells. So we have a special name for types of organisms that are consuming food to acquire energy, and we call these organisms heterotrophs, which basically means an organism that's getting its nutrition from somewhere else, meaning it's not building its own food, it has to consume its own food. So that includes all animals like yourself, funguses as well, and many single-celled protists also are heterotrophs. And not only do you consume and eat food, you also have to convert that food into a form of energy that's more suitable to a really tiny cell. Because remember, you're a multicellular organism, right? As an animal, you're composed of over 30 trillion cells. So food's pretty big, right? It's like fats, starch, polysaccharides, really large molecules. Your cells are really tiny, okay? So we need to break down that food and release its energy into basically little packets that a cell can use. And I also want to define the term metabolism. It's a very broad term. It basically is all the different types of chemical reactions that go on in a living thing. So there's thousands of different chemical reactions that happen just within one cell. You're constantly building bigger molecules, building proteins, replicating your DNA, modifying molecules, breaking down molecules. All of this in total is your metabolism. We're going to focus on a particular part of your metabolism that deals with specifically extracting energy from food and converting that into a usable form of energy. Now, that's not all of your metabolism, but it's a large part of it. Biologists that study metabolism are known as biochemists. So another term for metabolism, or the study of it, is biochemistry. So you keep hearing me say that not only does a heterotroph have to consume food, you have to break that food energy into smaller packets that are suitable for a really tiny cell. So my question is, what is this usable, smaller, suitable form of energy that powers all the trillions of cells in your body, allowing them to carry out essential energy-demanding functions. Functions like movement, growing by building your own molecules, like building proteins, something you're constantly doing, and also like pumping ions across the membrane, like active transport. So where do you get the energy to do these energy-demanding processes? Well, the answer is a molecule called ATP, which we're going to talk a lot about at the end of this video. But for now, I'm going to take you through a little diagram that shows the basic flow of energy through a heterotroph. So this is a nice picture because it really summarizes everything that we're going to be talking about in this entire module. So here in this case, we have a human, an example obviously of an animal, but remember that heterotrophs also include single-celled protists that eat, like for instance an amoeba, and also funguses like a mushroom. And understand that our whole goal is to understand where heterotrophs get their energy to do things. Where do you get the energy to move? Where do you get the energy to communicate, to respond to the environment, to grow? Okay? So we're trying to understand the flow of energy through your body. And the first step in that process is to consume food. You have to eat. Now that food can be from a plant, it could be from another animal, or even a fungus if you're eating a mushroom. But the energy in that food that you're eating originates from the sun if you trace it back far enough. But in either case, you have to eat food. The next step is to break apart and break down these large food biomolecules, because food is, like I said, consists of big molecules like fats, polysaccharides like starch, big proteins. So the next step is to take these large molecules and to digest them using enzymes, using acid in your stomach, using your teeth, your saliva. So an example of that would be the digestion of a large polysaccharide like starch, for instance, into individual molecules of glucose. But first, let's write down what this process entails. It is the enzymatic digestion of large biomolecules, like for instance starch. Now, this is largely happening outside of your cells. This is happening in your digestive system. So, your stomach, your small intestine, and it's subsequently these smaller molecules that are digested, like glucose and amino acids, for instance, are absorbed through the cells that line your small intestine, then transported into your bloodstream, and then finally dispersed to the individual cells throughout your body. So now at this point, we have a biomolecule. It's a little bit smaller, right? Glucose, it's a monomer. But that's not the last step. That still holds too much energy for the activities of a tiny little cell. So I've been trying to come up with an analogy for this. It's kind of tough. So we're going to say, imagine that starch represents food, right? And a certain amount of food. So does glucose, and so does ATP. These are all molecules, so they all hold food energy. but we're looking at the amount of energy that they hold from the perspective of a tiny little cell in your body. So starch, it's really big. It's like a whole restaurant of food. Way too much for your little cell. Glucose, quite a bit less, but it's still quite a bit. Okay, so glucose would be maybe like 3 meals, breakfast, lunch, and dinner all together. It's kind of a lot still. ATP is even smaller. Okay? ATP is like a little energy bar, a little candy bar, just enough energy. It's just the right amount to perform small activities within your cells. Okay? So this whole process largely involves taking a big molecule with a ton of energy and breaking it up into smaller parts that are more suitable for a cell. So that's largely what we're doing here. So this last step right here, going from a small digested biomolecule like glucose to an even smaller molecule, which is ATP, that's a process called cellular respiration. It's going to be the entire topic of our next 2 videos. It's quite a complex process, and it occurs within the individual cells of your body, specifically largely within an organelle called the mitochondria. And then finally, that cell has a molecule that carries just the right amount of energy to perform all of your essential functions. And that special molecule is called ATP. Okay, so always try to keep this diagram here in mind as we go through the next module. So we answered that question. What is this special, usable, and suitable form of energy that powers all of your cells? The answer is ATP. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about energy itself. And it's kind of a weird topic, but energy is basically, the ability to manipulate something or the ability to change something, usually by moving it or changing its position. And in the universe, there's 2 general forms or states of energy. There's kinetic energy, which is basically energy in action, doing its thing, moving. And then there's potential energy, which is stored and can be released into kinetic energy. Okay? So in biology, we're talking about living things which are made up of cells. And they primarily use 2 different forms of energy. And those are chemical energy and the energy of steep electrochemical gradients, which we learned about in our discussion on membranes. Now, those obviously aren't the only 2 forms of energy. They're probably 2 of the forms that you're least familiar with, because they're not forms that you can visualize, right? These are really small events. So you may be more familiar with mechanical energy, movement, heat, maybe electricity, friction, things like that. But remember, your cells are really tiny, so these are no different than that. They're just ones that are more abstract because you can't directly observe it. So the first major form of energy that is utilized by cells is a form called chemical energy. This is the energy of food. This is the energy stored within sugars, carbohydrates, fats. Okay? Specifically, this energy is due to the electrons that are located within covalent bonds. Chemical energy is a form of potential energy. You have to do something to a molecule to release that chemical energy to power a function. So to release that energy, there's one of two things you can do. You can either break bonds using heat, or you can use an enzyme to liberate electrons from a bond, subsequently allowing those electrons to form a new bond in a more stable configuration, thereby releasing energy. So basically you have to do a chemical reaction to release chemical energy. The other major form of energy utilized by cells is something called a steep electrochemical gradient. We learned about this in our discussion on membranes, but it is basically the tendency of a solute to want to diffuse across a membrane from its area of high concentration to its area of low concentration, right? Going downhill, releasing energy as it does so. So here in this module, we're primarily going to be discussing chemical energy. And again, it's kind of abstract, it's hard to visualize, so I'm going to try to break it down for you. Try to relate it to a form of energy that you're probably more familiar with, something like gravity. So here we have this individual standing on a diving board. Here we have them jumping off the diving board, landing in the water. So up here, this individual at this specific location has more potential energy. They have the potential to use gravity to fall. And once they hit the water, that energy is going to be converted as waves in the water, motion, sound. Okay? Once that individual has jumped into the water and landed, they now have less potential energy. That is analogous to molecules. So you can think of large biomolecules like, for instance, glucose or fructose or amino acids. They're the guy standing up on the diving board. They have the potential to release quite a bit of energy. Okay? And the way you do that is by breaking down these large molecules using enzymes. So this little part here, again, it's kind of hard to understand, but if you can just accept this as a truth, it's going to make this whole module a lot easier to understand. But basically the reason you get energy from food is that food, which is largely consisting of fats and carbohydrates, these molecules contain a lot of non-polar covalent bonds. And if you remember, in these bonds, electrons are shared evenly between the two atoms. When you break down digested food during cellular respiration, what you do is you use enzymes to break these bonds, temporarily liberating these electrons, and you do so in the presence of a molecule that really loves electrons, like oxygen here. And basically, when you break that bond here, oxygen's going to grab those electrons while it can because it loves electrons, and those electrons are going to be formed, or they're going to become part of a new bond where oxygen's involved, and they're going to be closer to that oxygen atom. So in a sense, this whole process deals with electrons falling towards oxygen, falling from, here to here, okay? I can't draw on this, so it's a little hard to depict, but moving from here closer to an oxygen atom, that little bit, it's analogous to this person jumping off the diving board, okay? So a lot of times in cellular respiration, you hear about electrons rolling down a flight of stairs or falling down a hill. That's what they mean by this. Okay, so the rest of this video is we're gonna discuss ATP. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. And again, this is the molecule that not only powers all the cells in your body, but the cells of every living thing on the planet, whether you're a plant, a fungus, a bacterial cell, or whatever. There is nothing unique or special about ATP in terms of the amount of energy that it holds. Again, it just harnesses just the perfect amount of energy for the tiny activities of a little cell. So it's a convenient amount of energy. And if we look at ATP, this is again like a cartoon diagram. It has three basic parts. If you remember back to biomolecules, we have our four classes: lipids, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. ATP would fall into the class of nucleic acids. It's very similar, as we're going to see, to a nucleotide. The only difference is that instead of having one phosphate group, it has three phosphate groups. So that's where the triphosphate comes into place. So the first question I want to answer about ATP is, where do your cells get the energy to generate ATP in the first place? We kind of talked about this earlier. The answer is from food. From the breakdown of small digested food molecules, primarily glucose, also fatty acids and glycerol, the components of fats, and also sometimes you can use amino acids too for energy, but primarily digested sugars, which all get metabolized into glucose. Then, within the cell, within the mitochondria, you break down that glucose even further and release that energy and store it into molecules of ATP. Now, it's important to note that both plants and animals do this process of cellular respiration. So a plant can build its own sugars, it can build its own glucose, but it then has to turn around and put that glucose into its mitochondria and break it right back down to produce ATP. So animals do the same thing. They just consume their food and then break it down. Plants build it themselves, then break it down. Our next question is, how do we use ATP to power the activities of a cell? So we're going to show this by using a drawing. And to use ATP, you do a simple chemical reaction called ATP hydrolysis. So we're going to show that reaction here. Here's our molecule of ATP. Again, it's got a couple of parts to it. It's got three phosphate groups. Remember that phosphate groups are negatively charged. The other parts are a 5-carbon sugar, just like you find in DNA, called, in this case, ribose. DNA is a little bit different. It's deoxyribose, but very similar. And then you have a base, just like A, T, C, and G in DNA. And the base happens to be adenine. So ATP is really similar to the nucleotide A, adenine. But our question here is, how do we use this ATP to power our functions? How do we use it to move or to build a bigger molecule? And we have to do something to this ATP. What we have to do to it is, using water, and also an enzyme, not depicted here. We have to break off the third phosphate group of ATP. So we have to remove that third phosphate group. And I'm going to show the result of that. The result is basically ATP minus that single phosphate group. So now that ATP has lost that phosphate group, its name changes to adenosine diphosphate for two phosphate groups. So it's ADP. You can call this single phosphate group just a phosphate group, or sometimes it's depicted as an uppercase P subscript I, which stands for inorganic phosphate group. All three things mean the same thing. And most importantly, when you break off this third phosphate group, you release the energy of this ATP molecule. And you can use that energy, well, to do any of the functions in your body that require energy, which is pretty much everything that you do, to communicate, to use your nervous system, to contract your muscles, to grow and develop, to build your own molecules, to build your own proteins, build your own DNA, pump things across membranes. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much everything you do at the cellular level. That's all powered by the energy released during an ATP hydrolysis reaction. Our next question is, how can one track where the released energy of ATP ends up, or where does it get delivered to? Is there a way to figure that out? And the answer is yes. You need to visualize the reaction that follows ATP hydrolysis, something called phosphorylation. And it's basically tracking where that removed phosphate group ends up. So phosphorylation is the transfer of a phosphate group from one molecule to another. In this case, from ATP to another molecule. Oftentimes in your cells, in your body, you transfer a phosphate group from ATP to a protein. And when you do so, when you add that phosphate group to a protein, it makes that protein more unstable, and it changes the shape of that protein, allowing it to do something. That something can be a muscle contraction, it can be moving something around within a cell, like transporting something, or it can even be building something. So in a simple sense, when a protein gets phosphorylated, meaning it gets a phosphate group added to it, the shape of that protein changes, allowing it to carry out a function. So let's draw this together. Again, phosphorylation always follows ATP hydrolysis, so we're going to take this illustration and just slide it over. So here are the products from our previous drawing. So let's label it. We have ADP, And ADP is kind of like the uncharged form of ATP. We've used its energy, but it's not useless to us. As we're going to learn moving forward in this module, ATP is a reusable source of chemical energy. When you're done using it, you can actually put a phosphate group back on your ADP to regenerate ATP, so you can use it again. We'll talk about how that's done. That's done during that complex process called cellular respiration. Here's our phosphate group. And then down here in purple is an example of a protein. In this case, we've actually learned about this protein. It's the sodium-potassium pump that facilitates active transport across your membranes so that you can contract your muscles and communicate via your nervous system. I also want to point out that you have a lot of ATP just in one of your cells. Each cell goes through millions of molecules of ATP per second. You actually have a turnover of your whole body weight in ATP per day. Okay, so you go through a ton of it because it's carrying out everything that you're doing that's keeping you alive, right, throughout the day. But again, thankfully it's reusable, so you don't have to eat your whole body weight in ATP to maintain yourself. So in this drawing, we're looking at the follow-up chemical reaction, the reaction that follows ATP hydrolysis, so we can track where did the energy released from ATP get delivered to. So what happens during phosphorylation is this. That phosphate group that was removed from ATP gets delivered elsewhere. That elsewhere, again, is usually a protein. So we're going to show that. We're going to plop that phosphate group directly onto that protein. And I want you to understand that what happened to that protein once it got phosphorylated is, hopefully you can see this, the shape of that purple protein changed. So, for example, that change in shape allowed it to pump sodium ions out of the cell, and it also changed its shape, so it's the perfect structure to bind to two potassiums to bring them into the cell. Then, if that phosphate group were to be removed, the protein would go back to its original shape. So I could use any example. That's the one protein I chose. The important point is that to track the energy of ATP, you need to follow that phosphate group, and that's usually where the energy gets delivered to. So this is where the energy got delivered to. And when a protein gets phosphorylated by ATP, it changes the shape of that protein, allowing it to carry out one of your essential functions in your body, like, for example, active transport. And then our last slide here is to try to summarize the various essential cellular activities that are powered by ATP. And it's really kind of nice. We can actually summarize everything that you do that requires energy in your entire body into 3 categories. Okay? And the 3 major things that you're doing that require energy on pretty much a constant basis is, number 1, the building of your own bigger molecules. Okay, one major example of that is the building of proteins. Remember back from biomolecules, proteins do everything in your body. You know, they allow for muscle contractions, they allow for vision, they allow for moving things around. They're responsible for your structure, right? Things like keratin and collagen, connective tissue, everything. So a fundamental aspect of a living thing is the need throughout all of your cells to Well, you use your genes to build proteins. That's an energy requiring thing, to build a bigger molecule, to put together amino acids into a large protein. So that's one way that we use ATP. Build bigger molecules. Again, that could be a protein, it could be your own DNA, right? Whenever a cell replicates itself, it has to replicate its DNA and build new DNA. So that's one class. Second type of activity that requires energy in your body is movement. Now that could be the movement of your entire body via muscle contractions. It can also be the movement of substances from cell to cell, or even within a cell. And these are carried out by proteins that get phosphorylated, so it uses ATP. And third, which we just drew out, we use ATP to do active transport, to create electrochemical gradients across our membranes, which we can use for other really important functions like our nervous system and our muscles. So that's it for this first video. I highly encourage you to watch both of the links that I provided here and on the very first slide. They're really good videos, and this whole module, both making your own illustrations, your own drawings, and watching these videos are extremely helpful for these subjects. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.